I think the one thing that has happened is that sterling, the value of the pound, has been affected almost overnight. Now, the impact of that, as far as most people are concerned, is that it makes imports more expensive and therefore pushes up, those more expensive imports. So the price of stuff just goes up in your supermarkets and the shops that you go into. So things get more expensive. Now, and we see that in the inflation figures. Inflation is now about 3%, which historically isn't necessarily that high, but it's much higher than it has been in recent history. And it's particularly, I think it's particularly significant during a period where, for most people, their wages aren't going up. So the price of stuff that you're having to buy is going up quicker or higher than your wages are going up, and therefore your cost of living will be hit. People are being hit in the pocket, and I think that's the most obvious way that we see the impact of Brexit at the moment. Now, after we formally leave the EU, that may continue to be the case. The Scottish government, for instance, estimates that about 80,000 jobs will be lost directly as a result of Brexit. I think prices and jobs will probably be the two main things that people will notice, and obviously trade deals being the other one that will affect particularly companies that have an interest in exporting and importing goods and services.
Scotland and its economy has benefited considerably from inward migration in increasing the labour supply and bringing younger people into Scotland. So there's a lot of concern here, and the Scottish government has of course argued for Scotland to stay in the single market even if the rest of the UK doesn't, but that has been rejected by the government. And I think the Scottish government would be very keen at least to see the potential for a separate or partially separate migration policy for Scotland because of the economic concerns there. Other economic issues in many ways are similar to the rest of the UK in terms of the potential huge drop in services and goods trade if you do have a Canada-style free trade deal. We've seen recent studies suggesting that Scottish cities might be particularly badly hit. Edinburgh and Aberdeen were quite high up on the lists in that piece of research. We haven't seen the sector-specific impact studies that the government is, of course, keeping secret. But so there may be sectors like food and drink that could be particularly badly hit, especially if we were going to go to WTO tariffs. If you look at Norway, the tariffs on smoked salmon mean they tend to put plants into the UK rather than do the smoking and the processing in Norway to avoid the tariffs. So I think if you start to look at it sector by sector, whether it's fish processing or the NHS or migration, it's going to have a very wide-ranging impact. And just on fish, because that's often seen as very sensitive in Scotland and as an area where Scottish fishermen are seen as supporting Brexit, which in some areas they are, but in other areas, if you're exporting, for instance, live fish or shellfish and they need to get across borders really, really quickly, then actually you're going to have a big problem.
Structural funds as well, money that's come to Scotland specifically for great projects, whether it be, the University of the Highlands and Islands as an example wouldn't exist if it hadn't been for European funding. You go to most communities, and I live in Dunfermline, and the road next to where I live has got a 12-star flag of the EU where European funding came to help support that road, that investment, that infrastructure. So we're all, we've got all these examples across Scotland, but for the future, what is going to happen to monies that we've agreed to, whether it's through structural funds or other programmes? How are we going to ensure that programmes are not disrupted?
There'll be some kind of transition or so-called implementation period, probably of around 2 years or so. And during that period, I think we'll still pay substantially into the EU budget. I think a lot of the existing rules will still be in place for that period, or at least part of that period. But the important thing is the longer term, what happens beyond the 2 years. And I think what we'll see is something close to, if not completely, a free trade agreement between the UK and the EU. clearly there will be long-term liabilities that, for example, in the European Investment Bank and the European Development Bank and things of that nature, where we've signed up to long-term projects with long-term liabilities. At the same time, we share the assets of the European Union, so we need to get our share of the assets of the European Union as well. So there'll be a bit of a balance sheet exercise in that. But I think with common sense on both sides, we could reach a deal.